Hello. So this is going to be a topic of how to be persuasive in academic writing, in writing in general. So quite a lot of ground to cover on this one. What I was going to start with really is by thinking about this, which is, what is the difference between convincing someone and persuading someone? I think the dictionary definition is that convincing is when you change someone's opinion. So when you get someone to think the way you want them to think. But persuading someone, you persuade someone to do something. So either they have to take action, basically, as a result of your convincing. I suppose in theory, you could convince somebody without persuading, or you could certainly convince somebody without persuading them to do something. But in theory, you could also persuade someone to do something without actually convincing them that you're right, but by using some other means to get them to do something. We are mostly interested in both, basically, both convincing people and persuading them in this session. And what we're going to do is look at some of the linguistic techniques we can use to do that, but we are also going to link it to some of the sort of research that people have done into psychology and the way people think and why these linguistic techniques, as well as other techniques, actually work. But I am not a psychologist, so I would just like to make that very, very clear. So I apologise if I am totally oversimplifying the work here, but I think actually that's very typical of people in the persuasion business. So we are going to talk a little bit at some point about oversimplifying the conclusions that one can draw from some of the background research. Okay, so I'm going to show you a list of terms that we are going to discuss, that I'm going to use to kind of organize this talk. So what you're going to do is have a little look at these terms, think about whether you know what they mean or whether you can make a bit of a guess about what they mean. And if you feel like illustrating that by typing anything into the chat box, please feel free, but I'll give you a couple of minutes of thinking time so you can look at the screen. Oh, no, we're not going to talk about that yet. But first of all, we're going to talk about this gentleman. Who is this gentleman? It's Aristotle, yes. And the reason why we're going to do that is because the other way I'm going to organise this talk is by referring to what Aristotle's ideas about persuasion were, because he, of course, had lots of ideas on this topic already, basically, and surprisingly, they still work very, very successfully to think about this today. So his categories of persuasion were this, actually: logos. What do we understand by that? A logic, really, and order, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. Ethos, ethics, ethicalness, and also character as well. So that comes into this. Pathos. He also talks about karyos as well, which, as I understand it, means sort of immediacy. So current, how to make things seem recent and current and important, that sort of thing. Okay, so these are the topics. These are the ordering topics that we're going to use, but the actual terminology is here. So terminology that you can look at. Okay, so if we are feeling sufficiently prepared, we will start with our first bit of terminology. So this lovely screen refers to an experiment to do with this foot in the door idea, which people did to sort of test really how you could get people to do a big thing, okay? And you might not be wildly surprised, if you know anything about people, to discover that asking them to put this giant sign in their garden for people to see straight off wasn't 100% successful. But what the researchers discovered is that if they had got people to put a small, very reasonable sign in their window once, and it could be quite some time before, didn't have to be recently, that when they asked them again to put a giant sign, much more noticeable, much more in-your-face sign on their window or in their driveway, they got much better results. And this kind of experiment has been repeated. And so basically, yes, the idea is that if you want somebody to do something, you have to kind of lead them up to it in a series of small steps, basically, until you get them to do the big thing. Yes, what does that have to do with writing? Well, basically, when we're talking about writing, we don't want to just talk about the grammar we use or the words we use. We do need to think about how we're structuring the text that we're writing. And so, it seems reasonable that if you are constructing a persuasive text, you want to start with things that people basically agree with. You don't want to start with your big idea that might be a little bit controversial or a little bit hard to swallow. You want to start with the safe arguments first and build your way from the safe arguments up to the less safe arguments, if you like, the more new or the more outstanding or the more unbelievable arguments. The opposite to this, though, is that there is also some evidence that if you want to get people to agree to something, you actually start by getting them to say no. So you start by a sales technique. You start by showing them a house that is way above their budget. And then when they've said, oh no, I can't afford $1 million, you show them something that's just a little bit above their budget. Yes, and then it seems much more reasonable for them to say yes, basically. I'm not quite sure that works quite as well in a persuasive argument, unless you do have something that you want to contrast, I suppose, with your more reasonable conclusion, that you give the most outrageous statement first, and then drop down to your statement, which then seems more reasonable by comparison. So for me, the foot in the door technique seems a little bit safer than the door in the face technique if we're doing persuasive writing on a sort of serious topic, but nevertheless, it might be applicable at some point. So it's ideas about how to structure what you're writing. However, structure isn't just about the whole text. So here I have 3 questions that you might ask if you're standing in a line for this very familiar object. And as you can see, I have labeled the 3 questions, 1, 2, and 3. So you can either show me using your fingers, or you can type in the chat box, which of these 3 questions do you think is most successful in getting you to cut in the line, to jump the queue? Okay, well, you would be right. Number 1 is least successful, because again, this was an experiment that somebody actually ran to see what kinds of ways you could persuade people. And in the first question, I think it was about 60% of people said yes, because, people are nice. So 60% of people did say yes when asked that first question. You are actually very right. Number 2 was the question that got the most percentage. So I think it was 94%. 94% of people said yes when they were asked this question, and they let the other person cut in. But actually, number 3 still got quite a high degree of acceptance. Okay, so number 3 got 93% of agreement. And yet, number 3 really makes no sense. Okay, because obviously you need to make photocopies. This is not a reason. It's not a good reason. And so it's interesting that even if your reason is not good, just by giving a reason, by using the word because, you get more acceptance, basically. So what can we learn from this when we are writing a persuasive argument? Well, we need to give reasons, is what we learn for this. I mean, I think obviously we know that our job is to give reasons for things, but I think it's very easy sometimes in certain types of writing to forget, actually, or to think it's obvious, to think, you know, the reason why you're asking for something, or the reason why you're trying to persuade somebody about something, is it's obvious. That's why you started with your obvious argument. But actually, there is no reason too obvious to give a reason to help yourself get what you want. Does it have to be the word because? I don't know, actually. I'm not sure that they have tested other words as extensively, but I suspect not. So obviously, what we're talking about here is using linking words. So using linking words to make your arguments clear, to make your reasons clear for why you're asking what you're asking, or why you're trying to persuade or convince somebody of whatever it is you're doing. So the next slide shows some linking words in categories. So you can look at them, and what do you think the categories are? All persuasive, exactly. They're all persuasive. They're all ways of giving reasons, giving different types of reasons, I think, really. So, yes, the first group, I think, are probably about addition. The second group about time. Okay, so this is another way of kind of linking your ideas together. Contrast, result, I mean, very much, you know, the reasons and the results. Concession, so admitting that something might not be 100% true, so taking a step back, perhaps. And of course, reinforcement, yes. Okay, so making your argument clearer to people. So linking words, I think, are going to be a very important part of any piece of persuasive writing. And so what we can see really is that we don't want to be too hesitant about using these things, which is, I think, is fairly obvious, really. But again, sometimes the interesting thing about researching this sort of thing is that you discover that the obvious is actually quite true, but it's nice to have that reassurance. Okay, as well as linking words, though, what else can we use? These lovely yellow highlighted bits of punctuation. So what do we call this first bit of punctuation? A colon. And the second one is generally called a dash, rather than a hyphen, which is joining words together. Yes. Which of these two is generally considered to be a little bit informal, perhaps?
A dash, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, again, you need to think about the exact text type that you're using it for, but they are basically performing the same function here. We often use colons to introduce lists, and of course this is a list, but it's more than a list. It's not a random list. It's a list of things we've just promised. Okay, so there are 5 core characteristics of data quality. Well, you know, what are they? Here's my list. So it's a way of visually, as most punctuation is, helping the reader to see the connection between your ideas. Okay, so here is what I've promised. Here are the 5 core characteristics. Yes. Okay, super. Have a look here. Why do you think some of it's coloured in green, some of it's coloured in red, and some of it's coloured in yellow? So I'll give you a minute just to read and have a look. Actually, yes. I mean, I'm not going to criticize this paragraph at all in terms of wording or anything like that. But yes, what I wanted to draw your attention to is the length. I don't know if anybody came to my session on blogging, but you will know that bloggers are told off for writing sentences that are longer than 20 words, basically, because this is considered to be too many words for people to pay attention to. Now, of course, I'm not going to suggest that most genres of academic writing should follow that rule, because lengthy sentences, if you like, are kind of part of that type of writing. And they should be, because some ideas are far too complex to be expressed in short, punchy sentences all the time. So that's not what I'm trying to say. But what you notice here is that the longer sentences, which are quite crucial to the argument here, are not exclusive. Okay, so these are the ones that are way over 20 words. They're closer to 30 words. The ones that are yellow are kind of on the edge, just over 20, but there are a couple of very short sentences here as well. And you'll notice that the short sentences, well, here are used to frame the argument, basically, to introduce it and to kind of set up the connection to the next piece of the argument. So I still think there is a case to be made for, if you really want to draw your reader's attention to something, or to change the topic, or to introduce a new topic, a short sentence is a way of doing that. And it also helps people to balance these longer, more complex ideas that you're trying to get across. Because remember, what we're trying to do is make your argument easy to follow. Okay, and if it's easy to follow, you're more likely to persuade people that your ideas are correct, basically. Okay, so here are some tips based on this idea of logic. Start with what is likely to be agreed upon and build up from there. Always give reasons, okay, especially for anything that you really want people to agree with. Use linking words and other devices to sort of make the connections and to make your reasons in particular obvious, and use short sentences to draw attention and vary the pace or change the topic, that sort of thing. I have highlighted certain sections of some pieces of academic writing, and the idea is that you are going to see any of these examples of starting what's likely to be obvious, giving reasons, using linking words, and using short sentences in the green highlighted sections. It's quite a long piece of text to read for the first time. We will be looking at it again though, so not every green highlighted section is an example of what we're talking about. Okay, so about 5 minutes to look through that and see if you can find some examples. Okay, so yes. The things, I mean, there are more than one, and as you can see, there are more things highlighted here than we've talked about so far. So we will be returning to this particular topic later on. However, what we've got so far is in this particular motivation letter, so it's a letter of application, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, is something where we're trying to sell ourselves and persuade people that we should do it, is there are a lot of reasons. I mean, the whole thing is one big reason about why you should hire me. And sometimes, it does pay, I think, to sort of keep saying, yes, well, this is why I'm good. So here we got an example of somebody giving a reason, even though perhaps the reason could be inferred in a less persuasive text, perhaps. Yes, so I thought that was quite an interesting example of that. And of course, we've got linking words like in fact and equally to sort of try and indicate all of our things together. More interestingly, I suppose, is the use of this quite short sentence that clearly is a very key sentence in this otherwise fairly information-packed paragraph, basically. So it's the bridging sentence between the sort of background and what they're trying to actually get you to come and find out about in this conference. So that's probably the shortest sentence. I also thought it was interesting though that this last sentence has been cut because in theory we don't begin sentences with but. but this person has begun a sentence with but, because otherwise it would be a very long sentence. And this is quite a key contrast that they want to draw attention to. So they've broken a rule of formal writing in particular there, because they think that drawing people's attention is more important. Similarly, they've done this in the grant proposal as well. So there's another sentence in the grant proposal which begins with but. I've lost it somewhere, but I think it was there. Again, even though it's not usually considered to be a particularly good start. Here it is. So here we go. They've cut the sentence so that they can make it more punchy in this particular section. And here again, we've got a use of a nice emphatic dash, basically, allowing us to kind of give that connection in a more visual way. And obviously, again, that's considered to be, quite an important point. And notice it's the last point in this particular section. Okay, so we'll be returning to these texts later. So that reading time was not wasted, I hope. But in the meantime, let's get back to looking at another of Aristotle's little sections. So we're kind of still on the theme a little bit of how to organize information. And this is where we're talking about primacy and recency bias. And the idea here is that people did some research on how well we remember things in lists, basically. And again, it might not surprise you to learn that people remembered things at the beginning of a list quite well. And they remembered the last couple of things in a list, but the things in the middle of the list were a bit less well remembered when they were tested. And you might be wondering, what have lists got to do with things? Because just remembering, lists of information or lists of words is not at all the same as being persuaded. But there have been some studies to see if the things at the beginning of lists or the things at the ends of lists are the things that people choose. So I think there was a study that was done on ballot papers, so lists of people to vote for, basically, in America, where they have quite long lists of people to vote for, because they vote for quite a range of things, not just presidents and politicians, but all sorts of positions. And again, I believe that the suggestion was that things at the beginning of the list were actually slightly more than statistically randomly chosen than things in the middle, basically. So if you're job seeking, the advice tends to be that you want to be the person who's interviewed first or the person who's interviewed last. But what does that mean for structuring a piece of writing? Well, your first arguments, your most important arguments should either come first at the beginning or last at the end, if you really want to draw attention to them. However, it's not just the sort of whole text that we can think of like that, because it does actually work quite well if you're looking at sentence level in English. So here are 4 sentences, and I'll just give you time to process them, but notice how they've been slightly rearranged. And I'd like you to sort of think to yourself as you're looking through these sentences, where you think the focus of each sentence is. What do you think is the information that the writer is trying to get us to pay attention to? I mean, the idea, obviously the first sentence is the most neutral sentence. But in English, generally speaking, we put things at the beginning of the sentence that are new, that are not new, that are known. And we kind of push the new information in a sentence towards the end. Okay, so generally speaking, that means that anything at the end of a sentence is going to be more prioritized by the reader, but it'd be more interesting, be more paid attention to than anything at the beginning, basically. So people on the living on the outskirts is kind of the boring information, if you like. But the fact that they rarely travel to the center is the more interesting piece of information here. In the second sentence, therefore, the writer has pushed rarely to the end of the sentence. So they want us to pay more attention to the frequency. Okay, so not to just the existence of them not going to the center, but the exact, well, not exact, but the sort of qualification of the, well, they do go, but rarely, basically. So we're paying more attention to the frequency adverb here. However, that's not always true, because sometimes moving things from the end to the beginning can also draw our attention, can drag our attention back to the beginning of the sentence. So this third example is an example of, well, a grammatical technique called, inversional fronting. So there's a whole kind of area of grammar called fronting, which you can do in different ways. Yes, and when you front this information in a slightly strange grammatical pattern, as you can see here, because it's a strange grammatical pattern, because it's a bit unusual, it's dragging people's attention to the beginning of the sentence again. We'll come back to the last one in a minute. So it does mean that you end up sounding a bit like Yoda, okay? Because Yoda does this a lot. This is exactly what Yoda does, in fact. He fronts everything, and that's why it's weird, because you don't front everything, you just want to front the important things. However, in the chat box, I would like you to look at these 4 examples of normal, rather boring sentences, and I would like you to try to front them. Okay, so put what you think is the interesting information maybe at the beginning of the sentence, because sometimes it's easier to do than others, basically. But remembering that the end of the sentence is still interesting. Okay, so we're still interested in the end of the sentence. We just want to draw people's attention to the beginning as well. You don't always have to do much to the grammar, actually, to be honest. Some things are easier to front than others. Let me show you my ideas, although actually there are other ways to do it, and that's kind of the point. It depends what information you're trying to actually highlight. So yes, here are some ideas. There are some even more emphatic structures, so these cleft sentences that Olga's just used, that again, you know, draw attention to an unusual part of the sentence, basically. But yeah, it doesn't have to be complicated, though. You can just move, you know, your adverb to the beginning of a sentence, or the time phrase to the beginning of the sentence, and then it's not just the beginning really you're paying attention to, it probably is the end, actually. Okay, so here we're probably more interested in both of these 2 sentences to Yoda, because we've moved something to the front so that it doesn't interfere with the interest of Yoda. Whereas in the last 2 sentences, absolutely, we are trying to dramatize, we're trying to draw attention to the beginning of the sentence. Although Yoda is obviously also interesting, because Yoda is always interesting. Absolutely. Good. Okay, super. So the last sentence, where do you think the writer is trying to draw attention here? But I think it's actually, the thing is, as I've said, generally our attention is drawn to the end of sentences, unless we do something dramatic to make us look at the beginning.
I think also
comma
wanted to say that there
also sort of here acts as an end, okay, because usually we're using commas to mark off information. And so what it does actually is that where you've put the phrase, the bit before it then becomes more interesting. Okay, so you've broken the attention of the reader from just traveling straight to the end, and now they're going to pay attention to what comes just before the comma, basically. So again, here you're probably getting them to notice the frequency with this happened, or here the infrequency that this happened. Yes, so notice that we've got our nice linking word here, but you know, this linking word can be inserted to draw people's attention to what comes before, basically. Okay, good. So here are some of our ways to shift focus. And here is another way to shift focus. So contrasting information, basically. So this lovely picture here is intended to refer to an experiment where people about perception. Okay, so we're really moving quite far away from linguistics at this point, because it's to do with buckets of water, 3 buckets of water, in fact, a bucket of cold water, a bucket of hot water, and a bucket of lukewarm water. So if you put your hand into the cold water and then into the lukewarm water, what does the lukewarm water feel like? Colder, okay? So it kind of moves towards your first impression. But if you put your hand into a bucket of hot water and then into the lukewarm water, the water is supposed to feel a bit warmer, okay? So you estimate it as a higher temperature if you're asked. Where it becomes exciting is if you get somebody to put one hand into cold water and another hand into hot water, and then they put both their hands into the lukewarm water. Apparently this is very confusing because you're getting very mixed messages. And in fact, your hands will feel different temperatures, even though your brain knows that they're in the same bucket, basically. Yes. Okay, so the same principle is theoretically applied to arguments. So we're kind of a little bit getting back to the foot in the door in the face argument here, because, you know, again, if you're trying to persuade someone to buy something, it can be a good idea to show them something they really don't want first, before you show them the thing that actually they do want, because it looks better by comparison, basically. What we've got here, therefore, is about something about some comparisons. What do you think this writer is trying to persuade somebody about by giving them these particular comparisons? It is about probability, but you know, it's the using of statistics and comparison statistics to persuade someone. I think they're trying to persuade this person to go to Australia. Don't be afraid of the sharks. Coconuts are scarier. No coconuts in Australia, but plenty of sharks. But nevertheless, it's perfectly safe. Yes. And yes, obviously, Australia has many poisonous spiders, but don't worry, you're more likely to be killed by a champagne pool. So, you know, it's a dramatic way of lessening the fear of sharks, spiders, and long travel, basically. Does it work? Oh, well, apparently, this is what you know, advertisers believe, because this is exactly the kind of language that you do see in adverts sometimes. What we can do, though, with comparison is admire one of my favorite sayings about teaching. And what I'd like you to notice here is that, yes, this is a comparison. Okay, it's a comparison of 3 different activities, but also what it is it's a comparison that uses the same grammar structure. Okay, so tell me and I, verb me and I, verb me and I. Okay, to compare and contrast. Okay, so not just using statistics, but using grammar to get people to pay attention to what we're comparing and what we're contrasting. So it's called parallelism. Parallelism is this. And just to show you that this phrasing is more powerful, well, I hope it shows you, I'm going to show you this saying written in a different way. Okay, so notice that this is not parallel and that it loses, therefore, some of its power. Yeah, so there's no rhythm, there's no build up, there's no comparison here. Okay, I mean, there is, but it's not as impactful, basically. However, we're back to my favorite topic again, which is punctuation. If you want to make it even more persuasive, you can use this lovely item of punctuation, which I do enjoy. That's right. Now, semicolons are feared by native speaker writers because they don't know how to use them. But basically, it's really not that complicated, in my opinion, because you are using them instead of a linking word. okay, instead of a word like but, instead of a way of saying and, but, therefore, a semicolon joins two sentences together in a way that is supposed to say, you know, compare these two things, okay? Or in this case, compare these three things. So, you know, when used, it's subtle. It's not quite as obvious as a linking word, but it can be used if you're trying to get people to really notice the comparison that you're trying to make without, you know, using too many more words. Perhaps you've used your quota of linking words already and you want to do something else. It doesn't have to be three things, okay? We can use other ways to do this. So I've got my fingers here and I've got my numbers on these two sentences because I thought you could use the chat box or show me with your fingers which of these two sentences you think is a little bit more punchy. So these particular structures, both and, are notorious for drawing attention to different parts of the sentence. And remember that we said, you know, things at the beginning are sometimes not as interesting or not as obvious as things at the end. So this is a way of dragging the attention back to these two items at the beginning, basically. So we're not fronting this time, but we are using our nice coordinating conjunctions. So examples are neither nor, either or, not only, but also. So, you know, great staples really of this kind of language, but for a reason, okay? It's dragging our attention back and it allows us to make these powerful comparisons and, you know, make people pay attention to the fact that we're comparing something. So yes, parallelism, adding punctuation to compare and contrast things, using these conjunctions, very useful. And just to really convince you of why this sort of thing is important, I've got 3 literary quotations, and in the chat box, I thought you could identify the writer. It's the same writer for all 3. So yes, let me show you the answer. It is, of course, Shakespeare, and these are the plays that they're from. So yes, notice that he is using parallelism here, and it's a particularly good form of parallelism, actually, because he's building up to the last example. So he has got this sort of parallel of love and then a quantifier. But the last one is slightly changed and slightly longer. And a more pop culture one is Superman. So the saying for Superman is it a bird? Is it a plane? No, it's Superman. So again, an example of parallelism where you're building up to the last item. But the point I'm trying to make here really is that in each of these items, there are 3 things. And this idea of using 3 things, 3 adjectives, 3 nouns, 3 parallel phrases, is acknowledged to be, how one writes, how one persuades people. So you always give 3. I'm not sure anybody's ever actually proved as to why this works. As far as I can tell, everyone just has decided that it works, and so that's what they use. And I suppose, therefore, we're kind of used to it. And so that's part of why it works. But it turns up, this groups of 3, in all sorts of writing, all sorts of powerful writing, including Shakespeare. These are not the only examples from Shakespeare. Okay, so our tips for Karios, because I think this is all to do with, showing people what's relevant, showing people what's most important, drawing people's attention to the beginnings or the ends, is that you can put highlights at the beginning of a text or of a sentence, or the end, or in front of a comma, if you're using that technique. And I'm afraid this is a grammatical terrible sentence, but it amused me. So shift the focus with conjunctions, emphasize with the rule of 3, and contrast with parallelism. And finally, semicolons, emphasize connections. So back to our example text again, and I'll give you less time this time. So have a look and see if you can find any examples of these things in the green highlighted sections of the text. I think you found all of the ones that I was particularly interested in. I mean, the title actually of this conference abstract is itself a contrast. So is dead, long live digital era governance. I mean, it's also a literary reference, but you know, that's why it was in the literary canon in the first place, because it's got this parallelism, basically, this connection, this rephrasing. But yeah, the dash is also significant for sure. And one of the things I thought was interesting about this grant proposal was the phrase "never before." So never before has a software research project been the focus for the development of archival strategy, as a very punchy sentence. That's a very strong sentence in that you know, using this fronting technique. Basically, and again, you know, the key section really, the sort of second section, the statement of innovation at the very beginning of this quite lengthy proposal, obviously, because that's how they work, isn't it? And it goes on with more statistics, as I'm sure you can imagine. But, you know, the first two paragraphs, and that's how the second very key introductory paragraph, if you like, ends. Yeah, with that really strong sentence. Okay, yes, good. But as you've mentioned, I think you found a number of others, and you know, notice how many times the rule of three is employed, basically. Okay, super. So let's keep going. In fact, I actually find it really hard now to write. This is a little personal aside, because I like to use both and, but I find myself trying to give three examples. But that doesn't work with both and so I'm always having to edit out both and, because I've given three examples of things, or you know, change my three examples, and I find myself having to do that a lot because I'm trying to use both strategies at once, which is clearly, you know, not possible. So you know, you can't overdo it. Okay, this is my first slide again, but I've changed it a bit. So those of you with particularly good memories, can you identify what I've added? I've added a number of things to this section about me, basically, about how fabulous I am. I've also added my initial, because one of the random pieces of information I discovered on the internet when I was looking up this is that if you add your initial of your middle name or your patronymic, suddenly you become more credible. I have no idea why that's true, or whether that's true, because I did not actually bother, I'm afraid, to go and look further to back that up. But I found that quoted on a number of occasions. So here you go, you've got my middle initial now for no apparent reason, but apparently it makes me more credible. But yes, I've added my qualifications, I've added a testimonial, and we're talking here about sort of social proof and credibility, and the role that you know, your qualifications for being an authority on a particular topic brings to your persuasiveness. And of course, unsurprisingly, you know, authority is useful. It is useful to try and add authority with your qualifications, with testimonials, although not perhaps as much as you might expect. So at least one study's been done where they took people who were considered credible authorities and people who were basically unknown or not particularly credible, and got people to evaluate their arguments, to evaluate their statements, basically. And interestingly, it didn't really change much in terms of, if it was a good argument, people would still believe it. So just having a very credible source for that good argument didn't necessarily make it stronger. And the same with weak arguments, actually. So being a credible source with a really weak argument, with a really weak example, didn't actually persuade people more or less than somebody without the same credibility. Where it did seem to change it was the more ambiguous ones. So if you've got an argument which is tricky, which is on the edge a little bit of being reliable and people assessing whether it's a credible argument, then having authority, having credentials did seem to sway people a little bit more towards your way of thinking. Testimonials are used a lot in sales techniques. And the example I came across actually is that even when people kind of know that the person recommending the other person has an interest in recommending them, it can still be quite persuasive. So they did this again. It's a sales thing. So they did it with real estate agents, and so the receptionist would put the caller through to a real estate agent, and they assessed the effect of the receptionist saying, "Oh, I'm going to put you through to Mr. Jones now. He's got 20 years of experience, so I'm sure he'll be able to help you." So even with that sort of obviously interested recommendation, it did seem to have an effect on how receptive people were to Mr. Jones and his sales pitch, basically. So it seems to work best at the point at which people make decisions. So you find testimonials on websites at the point at which you have to click and say, yes, I will buy this product, or yes, I will sign up for this. That's when you put your testimonial. That's when it works best. However, I did want to draw your attention to the fact that actually these persuasive techniques that we've been talking about, you can't just use them randomly. And when you're looking at persuasion on the internet, you find a lot of slightly random advice. And when you're trying to be persuaded, when somebody's trying to sell you something, you do find that you notice some of the more blatant techniques that they're using, and it's not always successful. It can be a bit of a turn-off. So there is, quite a lot of investigation into what turns people off. So, for example, I am not entirely convinced that my credentials here are particularly persuasive when I'm talking to you guys, or for this particular topic. Any idea why not? Can you identify why I did not chuck this in at the beginning of the talk anyway? Also, this testimonial is from 2018, so it's not a particularly current testimonial, so why should you believe it? So I just wanted to include this because, good credentials are good, but on the other hand, if they are not particularly believable, or if you're stretching the link to the University of Cambridge, as I am here, then it can actually act as a turn-off. So, you have to know when to use these kinds of techniques. Okay, framing. So we're kind of onto the idea now of, some of the more underhand, I suppose, techniques that salespeople use. One of the techniques that is considered to be successful is telling people what kind of person they are when you want to persuade them to behave like that kind of person. So telling people that you're very generous when you want them to give money to charity, or telling people that they are very rational when you want them to weigh up an argument. And this is considered a good strategy. Another strategy is illustrated by this picture. This is actually Heather. Okay, so it's my name. Sorry. Yes, so it is actually Heather. And one of the reasons why I'm mentioning this is that I don't know if you've ever noticed that when people are trying to sell you things, they often use your name a lot. And I've experienced this when people are trying to sell me a product, or when they're trying to sell me themselves in an interview, is that they will say, well, Heather, I think you'll find, blah, 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 blah. And they drop Heather into the conversation, quite a lot, actually. And again, I wanted to talk about this because it is considered to be good sales pitch, but I think they are wrong because they're using it wrong, because you don't say Heather when you're in a one-to-one conversation very much. you just talk to that person. So what they're misunderstanding is the idea that you want to make things personal. You want to make the writing in certain types of writing. You want to make the reader feel as though you are talking directly to them. And sometimes that can work with a name. If you put Dear Heather at the top of an email, I feel like you have written me personally an email and not just copied and pasted this email to 700 different people. And I've used that strategy myself, and I have discovered that when I name the person I'm emailing at the beginning of an email, even if I am copying and pasting the body of the email, I get much better responses, even if the response is, oh, I'm sorry, Heather, I can't come to your workshop. Maybe next time, but I get a response. Whereas if I send out a form email with no name on it, I don't get that response at all, and I don't get any participants in my workshops. But it doesn't work if you just randomly drop it in. But what does work is making the reader feel as though you are talking directly to them. So maybe using names in an appropriate place is one way, okay, but personalizing the information. So I have occasionally changed the email that I send slightly to reflect some aspects of the person I'm talking to, even if sometimes it's just a little bit of a gossip at the beginning or a gossip at the end. Obviously, you can also use the word you, okay, talk directly to the reader, or use the word we when you mean the writer and the reader. Imperatives are often used in sales techniques. Do this or you'll regret it. And of course, asking the reader a direct question, either as a real question or as a more rhetorical question that you're going to answer a bit later, can be a good way of involving the reader. But you've got to be careful with most of these, because a lot of these are considered to be very unacademic, basically. So you wouldn't be using it in your average research paper, but as you can see, what we've been looking at, the examples I've given you, are not that kind of writing. And so you might find that using these techniques can be quite useful in some contexts, basically. However, what is less controversial is that you need to choose your words carefully. So here I have a selection of what I'm calling power words, very strong words. They're all verbs, as it happens. You've got to be careful about some of these words. And especially, I think, in a proposal, you don't want to be too neutral. Okay, you're not supposed to be neutral. You are supposed to be selling, exciting the reader a little bit about this idea that you have that you want funding for, basically. So, carefully using some of these words, although certainly not all of them all at the time, is an idea, I think, that might be something to do. So the actual topics, I think, are kind of evident here, are newness. So we've got things like ignite, kindle, advance. Advance is a fairly neutral one. Yes, so health, you've got energize, alleviate. Alleviate is not a particularly punchy word, but it is an interesting word, and connected to the idea of making things better and toning down problems a little bit. Revenge, I thought, was a topic, so we can reclaim something or we can vindicate a decision. And trust. Okay, so I mean, we hope really that there are a lot of words to do with trust in our academic writing. A lot of what we're doing is trying to get people to trust us. So words like confirm really is quite useful, basically. Yes, no, I agree. It's certainly, you wouldn't want to use the name of people in that situation, for sure, but you do want to give them the feeling that you are excited by your own project, I think. But also, you do also want to give the feeling that you are talking to that organisation, not every other organisation you sent the same proposal to, if that's a possibility. And the same with job applications, basically. Well, especially even more so with job applications. Yeah, so having said that, I do take on board your concerns about overly punchy and overly hyped language. Okay, so we are talking about hyperbole here, and you do have to use it carefully. But on the other hand, what you want to do is be a little bit less hedgy than you might otherwise be. So hedging is when you soften your arguments. Okay, so when you don't sound too overconfident, if you like, about things. So again, I've got 4 sentences on the next slide. And again, you're going to choose the sentence that you think is appropriately softened, but not softened too much. Okay, so it's hedging, but it's not hedging too much. Okay, so you sound confident, but not overconfident. I'll show you my choice. That's the one I like. I do agree, actually, that two is not bad, which is why it isn't crossed out. So 2 has been softened. Okay, so we're not being overconfident. We will definitely find beetles, which, you know, perhaps in most forms of academic research and research in general, you have to be, you know, very confident about your hypothesis before you can use the word will. But actually might is very soft. It is very hedged. You know, we might not, who knows? I don't know. I haven't done any work before this to help me decide whether this is a good idea or not. So might, I think, is going too far. Will tend to, yeah, tend to is a nice way of hedging slightly, but, you know, implying that there's you know, a pretty strong chance. But the word should is underused, I think, in, well, academic writing and in general, because it's a very powerful choice of modal verb, because it generally means that this will happen if conditions are as we expect. So where is my driving license? Well, it should be in the second drawer to the left. Okay, so if the universe is as I expect, okay, because that's where it lives, that's where the driving license will be. That is where the driving license lives. Or what's the weather like in Russia in winter? Well, it should be pretty cold in January, you know, -10 maybe, certainly below 0. Okay, so if the universe is as we expect, that is what we will find. Okay, so it's a way of hedging, because sometimes the universe is not as we expect, but it definitely doesn't sound overconfident. Okay, so it's a nice way of saying will without actually saying will. I mean, this is why tend to works. Tend to generally is a bit like saying frequently, actually. So to be honest, it is almost like a frequency adverb here. So, you know, this is what usually happens when this happens. And should is a step up from that. So this is what usually happens if the universe is, you know, is as the universe should be, basically. Yes, so I recommend the word should when you want to make a strong statement of likelihood, without sounding too overconfident, but also without sounding too unconfident either. Okay, so ethos is what we're talking about here. Character, being an authority, being reliable, basically. See if you can find any examples of showing credentials, although to be honest, that's going to be, you know, fairly a lot of those, including testimonials, maybe speaking directly to the reader, using power words carefully, maybe, but still using them, and hedging authoritatively. So I'll give you, again, about 3 minutes to have a little look through our green sections. We've got the hedging in the should, which is quite an interesting use of it. And again, you know, if everything goes well, if the universe is as expected. What I thought is interesting, actually, is this person is using from framing. Okay, so the Spring Arbor University is well known for its excellent reputation as a teaching institution. we hope it's true. I mean, this is the point, is that you shouldn't frame unless unless it is true. Otherwise, it does come across as a sales technique. But if it is true, then it is a good way of telling people, about this, and then connecting yourself to this particular quality, basically, that you want the university to pay attention to in you, is the idea. So I thought that was quite interesting, because both of these sections start like that. But there is evidence of it personalizing it as well. So you could send this letter, most of this letter, to almost any university. Not the name of the university being included notwithstanding, and there are quite a few examples of the name of this university, so I do wonder whether they're using that over-naming technique here, which can backfire, as we mentioned. But what this person has done is that they have really made this letter personal to this type of college. Okay, so they've emphasized what they like about this type of college, not just, hire me, I'm so good, basically. So that's an example of personalization, I think, which works better than just, hello, Heather. Well, Heather, let me tell you about myself, Heather, that kind of thing. However, as you noticed, again, in the grant proposal, in particular, actually, there really are a lot of power words. Yeah, and this is not, this is given as an example of a good grant proposal, and I think it's a real grant proposal, which I assume therefore got funded, and it is particularly in the first few paragraphs, basically, where and especially in this abstract, where they have used a lot of very punchy language, as you've picked out in this text, really. So, power words, I mean, they're reasonable power words. They're not perhaps over power words, but, the best practices, a new approach, so emphasizing newness, unified approach, best practices, blah, blah, blah. There are some punchy words, that essential role, etc., increasingly important part. So, using adverbs and modifiers to punch up a bit further, basically. Yes, so not completely unknown even in that kind of text. But I thought I would introduce you to this gentleman, who is famous for, I think, having one of the most successful TED Talks of all time, basically. And as with all of these things, people have gone through it and then tried to work out what makes this talk so successful and so persuasive. So it's considered not only successful because people have watched it a lot, but persuasive because people donated to the organization that he's talking about. And I think they assessed it as a talk which generated $5,500 a minute, basically, because that's how much people donated in total when they watched this talk. Now, we're going to look at some of the things that people say are the reason why his talk is so persuasive, but I would like to point out that my cursory Google search to find a nice image for this slide had quotes on it, which you will notice he is using the rule of 3, and he is using parallelism. So he's using repetition of a sort of grammatical structure to get his points across. So I'm sure he used many techniques to actually persuade people here, but the one that somebody actually analysed was to analyse the proportion of sort of storytelling to the proportion of statistics, to factual information that he used in his speech. And the next graphic is going to show you that proportion. So this was the amount of time or the amount of words that were assessed as falling into these 3 categories. So the logos, the data, because statistics and data do fall, of course, into the idea of logic and convincing people by a good argument. Yes, there was his own, backstory and who he was. But a lot of, apparently, his talk consisted of telling stories. Now, that is nice, but it's only one example. So is telling stories more persuasive than using statistical data? And of course, when we're talking about academic research, the answer is, probably not. You're not going to get very far with a good story if you're submitting your academic research paper to a journal, or for that matter, submitting your grant proposal without, a great deal of statistical and factual information to back it up. But nevertheless, it is quite interesting to sort of think about the idea that, examples, credible examples, stories can be quite persuasive, and possibly might have a place in some certain texts or certain parts of texts that we're going to use, in our academic lives, basically. And the interesting part about this is why it works. And obviously people tend to say, well, people like a human interest. But there might be an idea that it's to do with sort of central and peripheral processing. So this does illustrate the sort of physical idea of this, is that when you're driving along, what you can see is in the middle, and then we have our peripheral vision off to one side that we're not paying quite as much attention to. And generally speaking, it is true that if you want somebody to properly weigh up your arguments, you really need to get them to pay attention to those arguments. People can be quite dismissive, actually, of things that don't fall into their already established view of the world, if they're not paying, really good attention, if they're not willing to commit to paying really good attention to the arguments that you're putting forward. Whereas you can persuade people to do things if they're not paying attention too. But if they're not paying attention, they do tend to be more swayed by more emotional arguments, more storytelling type arguments, but that persuasion is not very sticky. So it's also quite easy to unpersuade people again. So by and large, with the kind of serious persuasion that we're talking about, I think, with academic English, we really want them to be paying attention. But the point here is not whether to use stories or statistics. The point really is that you want people to pay attention. And to get their attention, you do have to use these ideas of drawing attention, of making it interesting, of contrasting and comparing, of using powerful language, certain types of powerful language, to get them to pay enough attention to then weigh up your arguments properly, basically. So I think that's really the message, not that we should be telling more stories, but that we should be getting people to pay attention to what we're saying and not relying on them being professional enough to do it without using language. Our final going through of this, which I won't actually bother to give you any time for this, but our final look at this example is that there was a small example of getting the reader to kind of imagine something beyond a sort of purely factual argument in our grant proposal, which is this lovely image here that they've included. So software and the traces of the creation are slipping through our fingers faster than any past media, from papyrus to film. So it's not a story. Well, it is a story. That's kind of the whole history of written information, basically, in one sentence, and they've included, quite a visual metaphor there to make that point, basically. And so again, you wouldn't want to overdo it, but even in academic writing, there might be room for some of this kind of language and for some of these techniques. That's the summary. Okay, so these are all the four sort of categories that we've been talking about, thanks to Aristotle, and all the tips that I've given over the course of this talk. Oh, I've got references. Some of them are references to some of the studies that I've mentioned. I have a horrible feeling, by the way, I did get my water the wrong way round. I genuinely now cannot remember, and I've lost my notes as to whether cold water makes the water feel colder or hotter. I can't remember now, but so I might have got that the wrong way round. But somewhere in these references is a reference to the exact study there. The one I actually thought was particularly interesting as a writing manual, if you like, is this one, actually. And I thought this is a sort of a grammar reference book, but a different one to ones that I've come across usually in my career as an English language teacher, because it is talking about the effects of different grammatical choices and so on. And it's not really written for second language learners. It's kind of trying to explain to native speakers, I think, the effects of different grammar on their own writing. And so it's a slightly weird mixture of trying to explain basic things like what is a noun to people who don't know much about grammar, but also very sophisticated looking at the position of commas in a sentence. And so actually this is it's not even particularly long actually, and it's got so some of what I've been saying here has been borrowed from this, or plus some other things as well. But that's a particularly interesting book, I think, if you're interested in the effect of all sorts of little things, grammatical, linguistic tricks. Not tricks, because she's not talking about tricks. She's not trying to sell it. She's just talking about the effects of different writing techniques.